Today is Wednesday. It is January the 19th, 2022, and we're continuing our chronological study of the Scriptures. Our focus for this week is in the book of Isaiah, that wonderful prophetic book, and we introduced to you yesterday Isaiah chapter 1. Today our Scripture reading is Isaiah chapter 2 and chapter 3. Now, this is the first of two devotional commentaries for today. The title of this one, The Prophecies of Isaiah. Allow me to introduce it. As you read today's scripture, I invite you to take time to not only reflect on its prophetic applications to the house of Judah, but the lessons you and I might take from the study that are applicable to our day. Now, remembering the prophetic ministry of Isaiah spanned the reigns of four kings of Judah. We saw that in chapter 1 and verse 1. The scholars place Isaiah chapter 2 during the reign of Uzziah, who reigned for 52 years. Now, you know that Uzziah, as we've already studied it earlier in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, had a brilliant career. His rule was prosperous. All of Judah really were blessed during the majority of his reign. And sadly, though, we read in verse 16 of 2 Chronicles 26, until Uzziah's heart was lifted up with pride, and he sinned against God. Now, as you read Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, I want to remind you of a thought. As goes the leaders, so goes the nation. You know, our leaders of our nation, like the leaders of your nation, are a reflection generally of the citizens of the people, the citizenship itself. That is, our character tends to be the character of those who are in office. They are a reflection of who we are, especially in democracies. Well, remembering Uzziah and how he was stricken with leprosy, the humiliated king had been thrust out of the temple. And in 2 Chronicles 26 and 2 Kings 15, the king was forced to live in a separate house outside the palace complex. In fact, if you remember, he wasn't even given the dignity of being buried among the kings because of his leprosy. Now, Uzziah entrusted the day-to-day governing of Judah to his son in 2 Chronicles 26 and verse 21 and 2 Chronicles 27. Now that meant, though he might have lived for several years after he was afflicted with leprosy, nevertheless, the duties of governing Judah were now in the hands of a younger man who lacked the skills and experience of Uzziah the king. Now, as you read Isaiah chapter 2, I want to remind you that there are many prophecies that we read in this book that carry both an imminent and a far-reaching application. Some of what we read in Isaiah 2 is a foretelling of events that would occur in Isaiah's lifetime. For instance, Isaiah described the exaltation of Judah and Jerusalem. In 2 Chronicles 26, verses 6 through 8, verified that Judah did enjoy the admiration of other nations, and they paid tribute to Judah during Uzziah's reign. However, there is much of Isaiah's prophecy that we'll find, even in chapter 2 here, that is even yet now to be fulfilled. Now, for instance, as you read Isaiah 2 in verse 3, about all nations coming to Jerusalem. Well, we know that has not happened. That is something that will only happen during the kingdom age when Jesus Christ is king. And so the nations say in chapter 2 and verse 3 of Isaiah, let us go up into the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And yet, the constant warring of nations against nations in our day and all the troubles in the Middle East would have us to realize that the world has never seen universal peace. And so Isaiah 2 verses 6 through 9 is a description of the Great Tribulation. I suggest you consider the prophecy that is recorded here to be that will not yet be fulfilled until those desperate times that are yet still future. Now, there were desperate times in Isaiah's day, and that is true, but the circumstances of that time are parallel to the 21st century. Now, we read, as we consider Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 6, how the Lord had forsaken his people. Why? Because they had turned from him and his law and commandments. Where had they turned? They had turned to soothsayers from the east, literally Eastern mysticism. And we also read in that same verse 6 that they had embraced the ways of strangers, foreigners, people who were outside of God's covenant relationship with Israel. Rather than trust in the Lord, Judah had placed its faith in riches and possessions and its confidence in the military. Doesn't that sound a lot like the day that you and I are living in? Chapter 2 and verse 7 describes the military of ancient times, full of horses and chariots. Even as you and I today look at our governments and our nations and their might and military. Well, the nation worshipped the gods, sadly, of their own making and of their own hands. They had rejected God. And we begin reading in chapter 2 and verse 9 something that will follow in chapter 3. And that is that the proud men were brought low. And you're going to see the weak men were then put in office. Now, 2 Kings, Isaiah 2 again, verses 10 through 22, I invite you to notice that it's a description of the second coming of Christ and the events that will surround that. Supposing my interpretation of this passage is indeed at the close of the tribulation period. You read in chapter 2 and verse 10, when Christ returns in his heavenly glory, his coming is heralded as the judge and the conquering king, and the people of the earth will flee the presence of the judge, and the proud will be humbled. The people and the nations of the earth will be brought to their knees, and the Lord alone will be exalted. Chapter 2 and verse 17. I have a closing thought for this, the first of two videos today. The millennium kingdom of Jesus Christ will restore Israel to her prominence among the nations of the earth. And Jesus Christ will reign as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords upon the throne of David. Christ's reign will usher in a time of universal peace, a millennium, for he will judge among the nations, chapter 2 and verse 4. He shall rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares or spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. What a wonderful time that will be. But it is a time that is yet to come. And this concludes the part 1 of today's devotional. I will follow it up with part 2, and I hope that you will follow this study in the book of Isaiah. God bless and bye-bye.